Hi everybody. So as Ken said, what I'm going to do is talk through some of the more common ways you could set up JIRA and Confluence, particularly connecting to external user management systems, because there's quite a lot of options here, and we're going to try and help you work out which one is best for you. So looking at the slide that's up right now, we're going to go through just a basic setup first. This is what happens when you install JIRA on its own. It just talks to its own database for users, groups, and authentication of users. We're just putting this up so you'll sort of see it before we go on to the more complex scenarios. So if you could advance that, Ken. So this is the LDAP support that you have in JIRA 4.2 and earlier. The users and groups live in JIRA's internal database, and authentication goes out to LDAP. You have to create the users in JIRA, manage all your groups manually there, and JIRA knows how to go out and check if the password the user has entered is correct. So what we've added is on the next slide. So this looks a little more complex. Let's focus on the left 2/3 of this. We have LDAP and we have JIRA's database. JIRA now uses that database as a cache for your LDAP users and groups. The reason we're doing this is essentially for performance reasons. Using an external LDAP server now has a very, very small performance overhead for either JIRA or Confluence because all the users and groups are stored locally to JIRA. If you're running in read-write mode, so if JIRA is allowed to update your LDAP server, when you say update someone's group memberships or email address, it's updated in the LDAP server and then copied into JIRA's database so that both LDAP and JIRA stay in sync. Authentication always goes to LDAP. A couple of reasons for that. One, we can't copy the password out of most LDAP servers. And secondly, if someone is disabled in your LDAP server, you want to make absolutely sure that they can't log into JIRA. On the right-hand third of that diagram that's in front of you, you can also see in a gray box the JIRA database with an internal directory. Because you can have multiple directories, you could, for example, have a couple of sysadmin accounts in your internal directory in case you need to make configuration changes while there's problems with your LDAP server or similar. So JIRA connecting to Crowd works in exactly the same manner as connecting to LDAP. That is, authentication always goes through to Crowd. If JIRA is set up in read-write mode with Crowd, it will push updates to Crowd, but it will always pull the users and groups from Crowd and cache them in JIRA's internal database. That's a major, major advantage for those of you running larger installations. The whole copying around the Crowd integration client and messing with ehcache.xml has just gone away. And Ken, if you could advance us to the connect to JIRA. This looks remarkably similar. That's because JIRA now provides many of the same capabilities as a low-end Crowd server. So we'll talk about that in a little more detail later on. But for now, you can kind of think of JIRA 4.3 Plus as a baby Crowd. And you can advance, Ken. Excellent. So now with Confluence, Confluence can do all the same stuff as JIRA. It's the same stack, the same code, the same UI running internally. And also, Confluence can connect to JIRA. Now, we recommend this for simple setups. Our sort of rule of thumb is if you're running an install of under about 500 users and you've got less than 5 applications connecting to JIRA, then using JIRA as your user management server is a good idea. We're not recommending it for larger, more complex installations, primarily because that makes one JIRA server a single point of failure. So for example, when you have to upgrade that server, you take out your development suite, which is great when you've got 20 or 50 or 100 people, but if you're in charge of an installation for 15,000 people, you don't want to be in a situation where one rogue JIRA plugin can do a denial of service on your entire development infrastructure. And we can move on, Ken. So that leads nicely into why we use Crowd. So one important limitation to be aware of the connecting to JIRA functionality is that JIRA 4.3 does not provide single sign-on. People will need to log into every application individually. They'll have the same username, the same password. You know, if you change details, it'll update in the apps. If you, disable a user at JIRA or change a password, that will be reflected instantly in the applications, but they will need to be log into each of those apps individually. The second reason to use Crowd is custom app integrations. Gives you a bit more flexibility. Obviously with SSO, you can do a few more interesting things with Crowd than you can do with JIRA's user management capabilities. For example, features like aliasing and lower casing are only available in Crowd. If you need to write a custom directory implementation, again, you need to use Crowd. If in the past you've used one for JIRA or Confluence, you probably don't need to use it anymore. And the last reason is what we're calling the ilities, for want of a better phrase. It's availability and scalability. If you've got 15,000 people depending on your development infrastructure every single day, we recommend using Crowd for reducing the administration overhead. It stays available. It's one service doing one thing well, rather than asking a JIRA server with 50 requests a second to also be a user and group management server for a couple of Confluence instances that have 8 gigs of attachment data and are getting hit 50,000 times a day. That might work, but it's setting up a fairly fragile infrastructure. So if you've got big and complex needs like that, we strongly recommend Crowd. One rule of thumb might be is if your job is keeping the Atlassian development infrastructure at your organization up and going, you should probably be using Crowd. If, on the other hand, you spend an hour a week on this, just maintaining workflows for your team of 20, then you don't need Crowd.